what you do is you get to choose which of these you roll on, but you have to do each one entirely one at a time. So let's say here I go. I've got X powers. Let's say I get 4. I rolled 2. So I say, okay, no, by this I mean powers very generally speaking. I'll go to the powers subset, the specific table, powers. I roll on there, and I might get, say, paralysis ray. Then I go over to paralysis ray, and I see that it knocks people unconscious, and it has a certain range based on my endurance, and it costs me 7 power points. And that's all it says. Well, that one's easy. Well, there are a lot of others that aren't as, straightforwardly locked down in the description. There are others which are very wide open. And that you then have to go in and roll different things, or choose among a fairly substantive number of nested options to finally arrive at, what this means for you in this power. So if you get animal powers, get ready for a whole nother subject. All right, so what is it? Nature powers. There's a whole set of menus and stuff that you go through. So you need to work through all the way for whichever one you roll. Then, having done that, that's 1. I said I had 4. So then I choose, okay, I can roll again on the powers. I can do devices, magic psionic items, or skills, or magic psionics. So I choose skills. Like I said, I roll again and say I get, heightened endurance. Excellent. I have beefy endurance now. There's different levels of this and so forth. So I go over there and it says, okay, add 2d10 to your endurance. So I roll 2d10, I add 2d10. There you go. That's the deal. I go through and I get these 4. Well, am I done? No. Incidentally, as you go, you often find ways to conceptually link them as you go. That's not very hard and sometimes a little surprising. You're like, oh, what the hell? I've got this. It's crap. You roll the next thing and you look at that and you're going, oh, well, those two together, well, that makes way more sense. So that's going on as you're proceeding. Then you get to this part. You have to roll at the end of all this on a weakness table. Some of them are pretty savage. I mean, you may have, you may get a serious weakness. There's nothing like rolling, 3d10 and suddenly discovering that your agility is suddenly 0 or something like that. So you're looking at these. Now, you have a choice. Easiest one is that's your character minus 1 of your rolled powers. So I had those 4. I'm going to have to junk one of them. I go through and I say, okay, that one's junked. So now I have these 3 that I rolled and worked up and the weakness, and I'm done. That's one option, kind of the default. Another option is to say, you know what, I hate the weakness. That weakness is ass. I don't like it. And then you have to junk another power. Now this is part of the flexibility of rolling a lot. If you roll a high number to begin and you end up with 6 or 7 or 8 things that you've rolled, then losing 2 really isn't too difficult. In fact, some of them may have seemed a little nonsensical, and you're like, oh well, good. I don't need that. It doesn't fit with the way everything else was coming together, and now I have no weakness. So those are effectively your options at the end. And whatever option you pick of those, and depending what you rolled and what you did with what you found out, remember, you can choose which of those sets that you roll on as you go one by one after working up the last one. So there's a lot of personality in this for what is effectively a random method of character generation. You have invested a great deal of thought or creative intuition in terms of actually settling on things. And sometimes the combinations are outrageous. I mean, to end up, I believe one of the kids ended up with very few powers, ended up with, I think, just invulnerability, a little flight, and chemical control. Now, chemical control with just those 3 powers, that's a lot of weight in terms of applicability. And invulnerability and flight, considering all these other things that you might have had, is pretty strong in terms of that combination. I mean, it's so, considering, that the player was, thinking about this and said, well, what about like carbon dioxide? And I said, well, how, you got really broad here. Why don't you think a little more like any, carbon and oxygen oriented compounds? After going home for a week and coming back after having looked up a bit about carbon and oxygen plus hydrogen compounds, he was kind of like, I'm on it. So that's been kind of fun. So we have here some pretty remarkable ways, pretty remarkable outcomes in terms of what people do. Many of them seem very underpowered. First level characters aren't actually all that tough, and or at least a lot of them aren't. And you may, find yourself be looking at your little kind of paralysis punch martial artist with, ordinary person features, attributes, and going, I'm really going to die out there. But that's okay. You will find, especially with a substantial group, that there is actually a lot of cool applications, a lot of cool ins and outs, about what you can do. And again, if you have very few powers, then their flexibility in play is maximized in application as we continue to play. So anyway, I have found those aspects to be very enjoyable. Now, what about play itself? There are some really interesting features. The game is textually focused quite a bit on combat. I mean, the combat section isn't really all that big, but that's kind of where the mind was at. We're fighting criminals, right? We have to subdue criminals in order to get them, taken to the authorities. There are really interesting quirks and corners. What if your character has a crap security clearance? How are you going to convince the authorities, that you've here's a crook. Oh, really? Take off the mask. Who are you? That sort of thing. So there are other corners too. You're evidently supposed to kind of keep track of your actual monetary assets, and you don't have anything to go by except the real person's monetary assets. So kind of a bit of that baked in virtue too. It's like, well, how much do you want to give to charity? Because you get experience points that way. So am I, the real person, supposed to kind of consider? I mean, I'm not that I'm supposed to do it in reality in order to get the experience points. That's not what I mean. Is my character supposed to do it fictionally? But that's an interesting question. I mean, would the fictional you actually, give up a bunch of money? So there are some other, interesting bits and pieces, but one of them is this chart that I discovered to be quite impressively consequential in play, almost to the point of, me saying, what, really? Okay, so this chart, which is the attack defense table, this is a scan that I printed out because my book is ancient, it's an original, and I don't really feel strongly about, dog-earing it or bending it backwards or anything else awful. I mean, even ordinary handling, it's really, this thing is 40 plus years old now, and I'm not liking, its look. Its edges are feeling just a little soft, and I'm like, don't want to treat this book this way. So anyway, I took some time to scan the pages that I would always be flipping to. So here's the table. And So you have attack types running across the top of defined by the most of the attack powers and things and hand to hand and stuff, and then the defense types running down the side. And the attack types all have little numbers in parentheses there, which is if they're up against just like hand to hand defense. So right there by, say, ice power, it says 14. Now these are D20, that number or less. So ice power 14 is, 14 or less to hit. And then that's modified by range. But then what if ice power is up against, for example, I go here, chemical power. Well, then it's 5 or less to hit. So ice powers are harder to hit with against somebody who has chemical powers. Anyway, so there's this whole matrix of this. Now, there are some important points. A lot of the matrix, there's a dash. And that means you go and you use the 14 for ice powers or whatever number is there for any of the others. Some of them are quite notable, such as Power Blast or Ice Powers or Force Field as an attack. All of those have really high numbers. So if you're just doing it as a default against somebody with one of these powers with a dash or just somebody with no powers, then that's the number you roll or less. But some of them, the attack powers are actually fairly tricky all by themselves. Transmutation is 9 or less. Mind control is 9 or less. Light control is 8 or less. So these things, emotion control is 7 or less. So that's the default. Now, then things get kind of interesting because then you go and you look and see which things, are easier or harder on that table for then their default. But there's one set of results, and there's a fair number of them, which are quite shocking because I encountered it through play. I mean, you can look on the table, but you don't really process these things when you look at them on the table without playing. But when I found that using a chemical power with a chemical power defense, now a chemical power is not bad on its own, 11 or less. But up against someone else's chemical power, it's 0. So rolling, you need to get 0 or less under D20, and the only way, therefore, to have any shot at it, and not a very good one, is to have some kind of bonus. There are several different kinds of bonuses, but that brings us to a very important secondary table, which is that you have attacker's experience level against the defender's experience level, and then that's got pluses and minuses as well. So in addition to that power versus defense thing, then we also, which gives you your basic target number, then you go over and see what your level is and what the defender's level is. And this is not as intuitive as you may think, because in Wargamer land, 1 versus 1, 2 versus 2, 3 versus 3 would yield a diagonal line of zeros all the way down, and then everything would just grade at +1, +2, either in immediate increments by every unit of difference, just +1, +2, +3, +4, or in sort of, slower escalation, so that you would have 2 +1s and 2 +2s and so on, through the table, a nice even gradation. That's not quite what you see here. The jumps are not quite as clear as that. The amounts are in units of 1 per difference. So every difference has its own specific modifier. But the 0 diagonal is shifted so that if you are level 1 attacking someone at level 1, you have a -1 to hit on D20. And that's the case all the way down. Your level against someone else's level, you're -1. And so if you are 1 level higher than the other person, then there's no modifier of this table. And everything after that is just increments of +1 from there. So it was a little alarming when, somebody chose to use power in a particular way and it was up against something that said 0, and then they also were at a lower level, and basically they're just shit out of luck. Their chemical power, grabs that dude, and, 0 or less. 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 And, 0 or it has no effect. That guy's chemistry basically, borks yours. So I wasn't really prepared for that. It was la-di-da, we're playing. Okay, I'll look up this table. I was like, holy shit, you're ineffective against this guy. Which is very interesting because it reminds me of reading the comic, and there the hero is, uses the power, and then it's like, oh, it's useless against him. A little shocking in role-playing terms. Getting into the fictional side of looking at things, you're like, oh, that's right. That does happen. So that's how it happens in this game.